Hi, my name is Caitlin Swanton. I'll be talking about the key arguments that are contained in the article written by Chung Hui, followed by my critiques. This article, originally in Mandarin, was written in 2006, discussing the thousand-character classic that contributed to Confucianism being brought to the Sinographic cultural circle. Hui starts this article by mentioning that the language of the nation is the spirit of the nation. Hui then argues that the thousand-character classic can be regarded as a solution as to why the cultural circle of Chinese characters is equivalent to the cultural circle of Confucianism. Hui then argues that the reason as to why the Sinographic cultural circle and Confucian cultural circle are undistinguished is because many people see them as being similar. Hui then goes on to make an analysis of the perspectives of the Western translators, who will be introduced shortly. First, we should know what exactly the thousand-character classic is, though. The classic was used by the Chinese dynasties for thousands of years, as well as other countries that use sinographs, such as Korea and Japan. In order to teach characters to the young, they would study this book to memorize the sound and shape of each character. As the name suggests, there are 1,000 characters, each being used a single time, never repeating. Mastery of this book then of course means that the student knows 1,000 unique characters along with their meaning. Despite each character only being used once, the book forms sentences. The book isn't discussed too much in the article in terms of translations, but in this picture here, I just threw in a translation if you guys are curious as to what goes on in it. Now, on the topic of researchers, we'll start off with the first European to translate the classic. It is also important to note that all the European translators were pastors except for one. Samuel Kidd was a pastor sent to Nanyang by the London Missionary Society and served as the head of the Anglo-Chinese College from 1828 to the end of 1830. In 1831, according to the preface of Samuel Kidd's appendix, the annotation and explanation of the translation of the classic are all translated from Chinese anthologies, and apart from a very brief introduction to the thousand-character classic in the preface, there is no interpretation by Kidd himself. However, this is the earliest European translation of the thousand-character classic in the world, and it is the first time to introduce the primary enlightening learning materials in East Asia to Europeans. The second translation is a verbatim English translation by the London missionary Walter Henry Medhurst, which was a translation based on the Korean version of Shi Feng's The Thousand-Character Classic. Because it is a vocabulary text, the English translation is a word-for-word translation of each Chinese character. In order to maintain smoothness of semantics, the translator added some necessary prepositions, auxiliary words, etc. on the basis of word-by-word translation, so that the English words are formed into sentences, aiding readers to understand the general meaning of the full text of the thousand-character classic. The third translation was written by an American missionary in September of 1835 named E.C. Bridgman. This translation is stated in the abstract after its title, discuss the format, length, content, genre, and author of the thousand-character classic, translated and annotated, and also commented on it at the end. He argued that the thousand-character classic is not suitable for children to learn from. The annotations within his translated classic are not a collection of annotations translated from Chinese, like Kidd's translation, but the translator's own understanding and evaluation, that is, Bridgman's personal interpretation rather than the translation of the original annotation. The fourth translation is the German translation by J. Hoffmann, who, unlike the others, was not a missionary, but was an assistant to the German-Japanese scholar Siebold Philipp Franz von. Other than this, not much information was really given on Hoffmann. As for Siebold, he worked as a resident doctor of the Dutch business in Japan for more than 6 years. During his stay in Japan, he actively collected many first-hand materials about Korea and the Korean language culture in Japan. Siebold used a stone tablet to reproduce the original text of the Korean wooden version of the Thousand Character Classic. Siebold contributed to many translations for the classic. For example, when he invited high-level Japanese translators to annotate each Chinese character contained in the Thousand Character Classic with Japanese phonetic reading. Since translating Japanese word by word requires a large number of annotations, which is not conducive to European readers, the full text is translated into Japanese sentence by sentence. As for the Korean script, since they had no other reference documents, they could only reproduce the original version, which was vague, causing them to leave some errors. After that, Siebold commissioned Hui Fume to translate it into German and corrected the Korean errors in the revision. Hui states that the English translation of Kids, the Thousand Character Classic, is only a complete translation of the original text with the Chinese annotations. And while Medhurst did contain the translation of a comparative vocabulary of the Chinese, Korean, and Japanese languages, both of these translations do not elaborate on the history and characteristics of the Thousand Character Classic. However, Siebold, Bridgman, and Hui Fumai conducted research on the origin and history of the Thousand Character Classic's Eastern circulation in their block editions and translations. However, it's worth noting that within this article, there were 3 different theories, all being completely different to each other on the origin of the Thousand Character Classic. As the classic was studied across all the different dynasties and countries within the Sinographic sphere, all the cultural material that were within the material were shared with the other countries. For this reason, Hui argues that Roman characters in the European language can be compared with sinographs. Finally, there is a quote included saying, "People generally think that the language you hear should be thought." This makes sense as the language that was heard was the content within the classics that were spread throughout the Confucian sphere, and thus was thought. To put it in other words, the Confucianistic ideals that were heard were then put into thought throughout all the countries that shared the reading material. Now, on the topic of what the paper is about, sinographs and Confucianism, there are ideas of harmony between man and nature and self-cultivation, balancing family, governing the country and the world that are contained in the classic. Siebold stated that in the process of being used as writing symbols by other national languages, the significance of Chinese characters is inevitably embedded in the language of the Koreans and Japanese, thus affecting their cultural thoughts. To conclude, we can think that Chinese characters are not simply the recording symbols of Chinese, but also a language symbol, which can be both pointed out and referred to. For this reason, knowing Chinese is not necessary to understand the cultural connotations within the text. For this reason, Confucianism is able to be transmitted through Chinese characters, which it did for thousands of years, causing the rise of Confucianism within these countries that primarily use sinographs for the purpose of literature. As such, Hui states that it is probably correct to regard Chinese character culture as a synonym of Confucian culture. As for my criticism on the article, there are many things that I think Hui could have done a lot better. For example, starting with the title of the article being based on the sinographic cultural sphere and the Confucian cultural sphere being synonymous with it, we can expect there to be a lot of discourse on the topic of this concept. However, apart from the introduction, Confucianism wasn't brought up as a topic until the final few pages. A large majority of the paper felt like it was just a discussion of the Thousand Character Classic. While I have no doubts the classic played a large role in spreading Confucianism, there is little discourse on other literature that was used within the sinographic sphere that undoubtedly spread Confucianism ideals. In addition, the introduction of European translators was a little strange as they did not play a role in promoting Confucianism in the sinographic sphere. The first time I read the article, I honestly wasn't too sure what Hui was trying to argue, as the very long introduction of European translators seemed irrelevant as to why the sinographic culture sphere is synonymous to Confucian culture sphere. In addition, the introduction to Siebold was a little strange, as he seemed to be the most important out of the researchers, but was first introduced through Hoffman, who didn't even come up very much throughout the article. I felt he could have honestly just replaced Hoffman's introduction rather than kind of introducing him as someone who worked with Hoffman. Additionally, there seem to have been many paragraphs that were just unrelated to Confucianism. It was more of a European historical lesson on the 1,000-character classic. I feel as if the article should have discussed more than one single piece of literature that was used within the Sinographic sphere, although Hui seemed adamant on using just the European translations to learn about how Confucianism was spread within the Sinographic sphere. This is a little surprising to me, as this article was written in Mandarin, meaning that Hui can, of course, speak Mandarin fluently. And as such, he had many resources he could have used to learn more about how Confucianism was spread through the literature. Additionally, there is no mention of Vietnam using this classic, despite Vietnam being a part of the Sinographic cultural sphere. Overall, I felt I was reading about the history of European translations of the 1,000-character classic rather than learning about how the Sinographic cultural sphere is synonymous with Confucianism, as is written in the title of the article. Additionally, the article felt overly long, giving us the history of these European translators when the focus should have been related to Confucianism rather than what European translators did to a book that was already over 1,000 years old. That's everything for my presentation, so thank you for watching.